Lynn, this question is actually from one of our historians, an FDR historian who is based out of Princeton. And I'm actually pushing together several questions here because he's submitted a great deal for discussion. But his major point is the following. He says the Depression, the Great Depression, resulted from a collapse of the banking system and of asset values. We refer to that as the Great Crash. The difference, however, is that the Roosevelt administration, in understanding that that was at the heart of the Depression, approached it slightly differently. With the Pecora Commission, it became clear that what was at the heart of the problem was a culture of corruption, speculation, and self-dealing on Wall Street. So that when FDR embarked on his policies, when he permitted banks that had been closed down to be reopened, they were reopened under very specific conditions, and the American people understood that the banks that were reopened could be relied upon. You've already referred to the Glass-Steagall Act. There also was the question of the creation of the SEC and a variety of other measures. But my essential point is that what Roosevelt's actions constituted, above all else, were a comprehensive assertion of state power over finance. And essentially, his New Deal represented a fundamental break with the previous role of the banks. In the Hoover administration, which preceded FDR, you had a model that was followed, which was much more of a British model. It was centered on the question of a financial policy designed to reassure the markets and to essentially allow the banks to continue in their previous culture. The fact that that policy failed, it seems to me, is one of the first lessons of the Great Depression, that stuffing banks with money does not solve your economic problems, and in fact, it does not even solve a credit freeze. But what I would really like you to comment on is your view as to this whole question of the assertion of state power, because it's my argument that this also was implicit in what FDR's concept was, although it was not exactly what was adopted when he designed the Bretton Woods system. I do have, Lynn, I have a follow-up question on this, but I guess I should stop here and let you address this.
Right, fine. Well, this goes into a question of history, so I'm glad I'm getting a question from a historian. We have to go deeply into history on this one, because the question of principle can only be understood by looking at history. We had a development in Europe coming out of the New Dark Age of the 14th century, in which there was a launching of a new conception of the state. It was not entirely new, because Dante Alighieri, with his De Monarchia, had made a similar kind of proposal earlier and was killed for that. On the question of language, this is where Dante defended the Italian language, which is the natural language of the Italian people, before Latin. Latin was a synthetic language imposed by a bunch of invaders who went up the Tiber and established, raped some people and made a population by rape, saving women. So this issue has a historical basis. Now, when the Dark Age struck, in the 14th century collapse of the banking system at that time, which was actually an extension of the Venetian monetary system. At that point, you had a dark age where the population of Europe collapsed. Conditions were horrible, mass death and so forth. But out of this came what became known as the Renaissance, the 15th century Renaissance. And this took the form of the great Renaissance of the Florence, which established a form of nation state which corresponded to Dante Alighieri's De Monarchia, but was more advanced. It was the Concordantia Cattolica of our dear friend, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. And it was the same Cusa who, a few years later, laid the basis for the establishment of modern physical science with his Doctor Ignorantia. His work had been preceded somewhat by Filippo Brunelleschi, the famous fellow who discovered the principle of the catenary as a method of construction of the cupola of Santa Maria del Fiore. So you had a scientific development. Now, out of Cusa's work, out of his De Monarchia and his proposal in the Doctor Ignorantia, you had the emergence of the first modern nation state in Europe around Louis XI. And then he was succeeded by an admirer of his, Henry VII, who established the second sovereign nation state in England at that time, whose benefit was overturned by his son, Henry VIII, or Henry the Hateable. So this corresponded to a plunge of Europe from 1492 on, with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, into a period of religious war and genocide which continued into 1648. Now, this went through several phases of evolution. And in 1648, you had the first effort to restore a civilized order in Europe with the Westphalian Principle. The outcome of this was to the Mazarin, Cardinal Mazarin, who was also an author of the Treaty of Westphalia, and with his associate in France, who established France as a new form of science-driven nation-state, which the British, and the interests represented by the British, sought to destroy at that time. Always actually the Dutch first and then the British. So as a result of this, during the 17th century, during the period of renewed religious warfare under the influence of Paolo Sarpi, continuing the religious warfare that the Habsburgs had started earlier, there was a new phase of war involving the Habsburg, called the 30 Years' War. During this period, there was the first significant colonization in New England, what became known as New England, by the Plymouth Brethren and then by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which established a system which is based on the influence of Columbus's intention in crossing the Atlantic waters to find across the ocean a place of refuge in which the best of European civilization could be resuscitated, free of the corruption inherent in Europe. So our foundations actually are traced in terms of law from the compact of the Plymouth Brethren and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which later suffered corruption later in that same century. But American law was established at that time, the compartments of law, as opposed to European law, the conception that Europe was a place of corruption. There was a great culture in Europe, but it was corrupted. It was corrupted by the continuation of oligarchical influences. Therefore, our law was always been anti-oligarchical. And I can speak with authority because my ancestors came over on the Mayflower, one of them at least. So we were there. This is us. This is our law. It's anti-oligarchical law. Now, the European systems, even though there were efforts to start republics in Europe, the British destroyed the possibility of a French republic at that time by the French Revolution, by the efforts of the British, who orchestrated that whole operation. And similarly, again and again and again. Europe to this day has not freed itself of the corruption, the oligarchical corruption, which was left over from that period. So in the case of the United States, we have a conception of law, of natural law, which is different than in any other part of the world as such. Though there have been many imitations in this, of the U.S. law and experience, and some of them more or less good in various parts of the world. That is, the American Revolution was an inspiration to the world as a whole of the possibility of taking the best of European civilization's culture, transporting it to a new part of the world, and making that available to the world as a whole, that precedent. Everything that's good that's happened in Europe since that time has been a product of the influence of this struggle inside North America, the American Revolution. And so our conception is based on that. And we have to look at this thing in that way, as I referred to the question of the debtor's prison issue before. Our system of law is predicated upon our history, and when viewed from this standpoint. We represent, in the United States, the heir of the very best product of European civilization. A European civilization freed in our constitutional view of matters from the evils inherent in the oligarchical traditions of Europe. We don't have fawns. We don't have an oligarchy. But in this process, we never really rid ourselves of the influence of our opponents, the British East India Company's influence among us, an influence which we associate to the present day with Wall Street, with the British East India Company influence with Wall Street and with outright traders inside our country. Well, this problem exists. So that on these questions, we go to our tradition is what we're defending in the sense of the tradition of those who came here, as into Massachusetts, to establish the idea of the best of European culture, of science and artistic culture, and the achievements of Europe in freedom from the legacy of the Dark Age. We represent that. And therefore, we insist on that as a defense of civilization. Our principles are not just our principles. They're not the peculiarity of the United States. The United States was created by this peculiarity of the intention of Nicholas of Cusa, for example, who was the one who said at that time that the corruption spreading in Europe meant that we had to defend the best of European civilization by going across the oceans to other parts of the planet and building up an area where we could defend the best of European civilization. Christopher Columbus in about 1480, when he became acquainted with this policy of Nicholas of Cusa, dedicated his life to that policy. And in 1492 was able to cross the ocean as he knew he could to a place he knew existed, because he'd consulted people on that matter. And his arrival here was the intention to create a place of refuge, to find the people in the Americas, and to join with them in creating a refuge, bringing the best advantages of European culture into the Americas, South and Central and North America. And in the process, with all the fights on this issue, the United States emerged as the paragon, which was the concentration of this fight against the British Empire and the corruption that is inherent in the British Empire to the present day. We have a system which is based on a credit system under which we are sovereign. We don't have a money system. We have a credit system according to our Constitution. Now, what happened, of course, in the process is the British are still out to get us. Not only did they give us all the wars we had, but they also gave us the assassination of President McKinley. And the assassination of President McKinley brought a traitor into the presidency called Theodore Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Franklin Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt brought us with the British, brought us the new kind of monetary system, introduced as the Federal Reserve System. And we had a guy who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, Woodrow Wilson, who was also another British scum and traitor, who was also of the legacy of the Confederacy, a British-created organization. And therefore we had in New York and elsewhere, and in Boston, we had a center of cesspool of British-style financier interests. We had, on the one hand, our policy was a credit policy, not a monetary policy, whereas the British created a system, a monetary policy, in which monetary power was superior to and independent of state power. A protectionist system, like the Roosevelt system, was a protectionist system against monetary power, for domestic as well as foreign. No private interest must be higher than the state, must be higher than the sovereign state. All interest, financial interest, must be subordinated to the authority of the state protection of the economy. And that's the issue here. We have to eliminate all traces of the evil which brought us to this point, especially under Alan Greenspan. And what was done was treasonous. It was treasonous in 1971. It was treasonous under poor Jimmy Carter. It was treason. The Trilateral Commission was an organization of treason, of British treason, foreign power. Alan Greenspan was a treasonous creature as well as a despicable one in general. So these things we are fighting against represent an attack on everything that this United States represents from its origins, especially from its European origins, from the origins of its founding in the 16th, 17th century. Therefore, our law is clear. And when we look at this law from the standpoint of history, its historical authority, it is what the world wants. It is what the world aspired to for so long, to have the freedom that we had in the United States. People didn't come here originally to settle this United States as refugees from Europe. They came here like Columbus to bring the best of European culture to a safe distance from European corruption. And that's our law. If we understand the intent of our law, after all, what is law without intent? Law without intent is chaos. Law must be moral, a morality which is based in the conception of the nature of mankind as a creative creature unlike any animal on this planet, the sacredness of human beings, and a culture which corresponds to the sacredness of the creative powers unique to the human being, the promotion of those powers and their proliferation. This is our morality, and our law, as defined by our federal Constitution, especially the preamble of the federal Constitution, represents that. This is the highest law. This is the only law we consider respectable on this planet. That every people have a right to the same rights we claimed in our Declaration of Independence, and which we claimed as legal protection in the founding of our Constitution. That's our law. The law lies in its intent, its moral intent, its purpose for humanity. And to the extent that we're committed to that purpose, we are committed to that principle on behalf of all humanity. We care as much for other people as we do for ourselves, because we know that protecting other people, according to this principle, is the only security we have. And because we love human beings rather than baboons. Anybody who doesn't agree with me should marry a baboon and find out what they're getting.